In the dead of night, the old hospital stood silent, its corridors shrouded in darkness as if holding its breath. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and decay, a reminder of the countless lives that had passed through its doors, many never to leave again. But on this night, something was different. The silence was broken by a sound that chilled the soul. Screams. Not just any screams, but agonized wails that echoed through the empty halls, as if the walls themselves were crying out in terror. The hospital, nestled in the remote village of Yamaguchi, had long been a place of whispers and rumors. Built in the 1950s on what locals claimed was an ancient burial ground, it had always been a place of unease. Patients spoke of strange shadows flickering in their peripheral vision, of footsteps echoing in empty corridors, and of cold spots that seemed to drain the warmth from their bones. The staff dismissed these tales as superstition, but no one could deny the hospital's grim history, a place where death lingered longer than life. Nurse Aiko Tanaka had worked at the hospital for over a decade. She was a practical woman, grounded in science and medicine, with no patience for ghost stories. But even she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that had settled over the building in recent weeks. Patients had become more restless, staff more on edge, and the old building seemed to creak and groan more than usual, as if protesting its own existence. Aiko had brushed it off as fatigue, the long hours of her night shifts playing tricks on her mind. But on the night of May 28, 2025, everything changed. The storm outside raged with unrelenting fury, thunder rumbling like distant artillery, rain lashing against the windows like the fingers of some unseen force trying to claw its way inside. Aiko was on duty alongside Dr. Hiroshi Sato, a weary physician with kind eyes but a perpetually furrowed brow, and a handful of other staff members. The hospital was quiet, most patients asleep in their rooms, their breathing steady but shallow, like whispers in the dark. Then, without warning, the lights flickered and died. The hum of machinery ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on the building like a weight. Aiko's heart skipped a beat as she grabbed her flashlight from the nurse's station. The emergency generators should have kicked in, but instead, the darkness deepened, swallowing everything in its path. From somewhere down the hall, a crash echoed through the stillness. Something heavy had fallen, like a gurney toppling over or a cabinet collapsing. Then came the screams. Piercing, guttural, they tore through the night like blades, sending a shiver down Aiko's spine. She froze for a moment, her mind racing. Were they real? Or just the wind howling through the old vents? The screams grew louder, more desperate, as if pleading for release. Aiko! Dr. Sato's voice cut through the darkness, urgent and strained. We need to check on the patients. Now! Aiko snapped back to reality, her training kicking in. She hurried to the nearest room where Mrs. Nakamura, an elderly woman recovering from a fall, sat upright in bed, her frail hands clutching the sheets as if they were her only lifeline. Her eyes were wide with terror, reflecting the dim beam of Aiko's flashlight. "What's happening?" Mrs. Nakamura whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. "The power's out," Aiko replied, forcing calmness into her tone despite the knot in her stomach. "It's probably just the storm. Don't worry, we'll get it fixed soon." But even as she spoke, she heard more screams, louder now, coming from other rooms. She left Mrs. Nakamura with a reassuring pat on the hand and ran to the next room, where Mr. Tanaka, a middle-aged man recovering from heart surgery, was clutching his chest, his face pale and slick with sweat. "My heart," he gasped, his breath ragged. "I can't breathe." Aiko quickly administered oxygen, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. She called for Dr. Sato, her voice echoing down the darkened corridor. As she waited for him to arrive, she glanced around the room, her flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. That's when she saw it. a figure standing in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, dressed in a white hospital gown, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes hollow and unseeing. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, as if frozen in eternal agony. Aiko blinked, and the figure was gone. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. The stress, the darkness, the screams, it was all too much. But when she turned back to Mr. Tanaka, he was staring at her with wide, terrified eyes. "Did you see her?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant wails. "See who?" Aiko asked, her own voice shaking despite her efforts to remain composed. "The woman in white," he said, his gaze darting to the corner where the figure had stood. "She's been here before. She comes at night, when the lights go out." Aiko's blood ran cold. She had heard similar stories from other patients over the years, whispers of a spectral figure haunting the hospital's halls, but she had always dismissed them as delusions born of fear or medication. Now, though, she wasn't so sure. The air felt heavier, as if charged with something unnatural. Dr. Sato arrived moments later, his face grim as he checked Mr. Tanaka's vitals. "Aiko, we need to evacuate the hospital," he said, his voice low but firm. "The electrical system is completely fried, and the generators aren't working. It's not safe here." Aiko nodded, her mind racing. They began organizing the evacuation, moving patients to the lobby where they could be easily monitored while they waited for ambulances to arrive from the nearest town, an hour away through the storm-swept mountains. The task was chaotic. Patients were disoriented, some too weak to move quickly, others crying out in fear as the screams continued to echo through the building. But as they worked, the screams grew louder, now coming from the abandoned wing of the hospital, a section that had been closed for years due to budget cuts and disrepair. No one went there anymore, at least no one living. Aiko hesitated, remembering Mr. Tanaka's words about the woman in white. She knew she should focus on the evacuation, but something compelled her to investigate. It was as if the screams were calling to her, pulling her toward the unknown. Against Dr. Sato's warnings, "Aiko, don't be reckless." She grabbed her flashlight and made her way to the abandoned wing. The door to the wing was locked, a rusted padlock securing it shut. Aiko rummaged through the nurse's station and found an old key, its metal cold and heavy in her hand. With trembling fingers, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was colder here, heavy with dust and the faint metallic tang of blood. The corridors stretched out before her, lined with empty rooms and broken equipment. Cobwebs hung from the ceilings like tattered curtains, swaying gently in an unfelt breeze. The faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance, accompanied by the scuttling of rats, or something else, skittering across the floor. Aiko's flashlight beam trembled as she moved forward, her footsteps unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. She passed room after room, each one more desolate than the last. Broken beds lay abandoned, their sheets yellowed with age. IV stands leaned against walls like skeletal figures, their bags long since emptied. The air grew colder with each step, as if the temperature was dropping to match the dread in her heart. Then she came to a room that was different. The door was slightly ajar, a faint, flickering light spilling out from within, like the glow of a dying candle. Aiko's heart pounded as she pushed it open, her flashlight illuminating the space. The room was filled with old medical equipment, covered in dust and cobwebs. In the center stood a hospital bed, its sheets stained with what looked like blood, dark, almost black, as if it had seeped into the fabric decades ago. And on the wall above it, scrawled in what appeared to be crimson ink, or worse, were the words, "Help me." Aiko's breath caught in her throat. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run back to the safety of the lobby, but her feet refused to move. The air grew heavier, pressing down on her like a physical weight. That's when she heard it, Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind her. She spun around, shining her flashlight down the corridor. It was empty, but the footsteps continued, growing closer, echoing off the walls like a heartbeat. And then the screams began again, louder now, more desperate, as if they were coming from inside her own head. They weren't just screams of fear, they were cries of anguish, of souls trapped in eternal torment. Aiko ran, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she fled down the corridor. She could feel something behind her, something cold and malevolent, reaching out to grab her. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she didn't stop. She reached the main corridor and saw the exit sign glowing faintly in the distance, a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. But as she sprinted toward it, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the hospital, shaking the walls. Aiko pounded on the door, screaming for help, but there was no response. The hospital was silent now, save for the screams that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She turned around, her back pressed against the door, and that's when she saw them. Dozens of figures emerged from the shadows, their forms flickering like old film reels. They were patients, past and present, their faces twisted in pain and anguish. Some were missing limbs, others bore wounds that seeped black ichor. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths open in silent screams, and at their center stood the woman in white, her gaunt face illuminated by an unnatural light, her hollow eyes fixed on Aiko. Aiko's legs gave out beneath her, and she sank to the floor, paralyzed with fear. The figures drew closer, their hands reaching out, their voices blending into a cacophony of wails and whispers. "Help us," they seemed to say. "Help us." The woman in white stepped forward, her movements slow and jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. Her mouth opened wider, and a sound emerged, not a scream, but a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. Aiko felt the coldness of her presence, like ice seeping into her bones. Just when Aiko thought she would lose her mind, the door behind her burst open. Dr. Sato stood there, his face pale but determined. "Aiko, come on!" he shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. They ran, not stopping until they reached the lobby where the ambulances had finally arrived. The patients were being loaded onto stretchers, their faces pale and frightened, but alive. As they left the hospital, Aiko glanced back one final time. There, in the window of the abandoned wing, stood the woman in white, her gaze locked on Aiko, unblinking. And then she was gone. The hospital was never reopened. Officially, the evacuation was attributed to a faulty electrical system and structural concerns. But those who had been there that night knew better. Aiko tried to forget, to bury the memories deep within her mind, but they always resurfaced, like whispers in the dark. She would wake in the night, hearing faint screams, feeling cold fingers brushing against her skin. She moved away from Yamaguchi, hoping distance would bring peace, but the shadows followed her. Years later, after Aiko had passed away, her daughter, Hana, found a diary hidden in her mother's attic. In it, Aiko had written about that night, about the woman in white and the spirits that haunted her until her dying day. Hana, curious and brave, decided to visit the abandoned hospital, seeking answers to the questions her mother had left behind. As she walked through its crumbling corridors, she felt a chill run down her spine. The air was thick with something unseen, something that lingered just beyond perception. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and the shadows moved in ways that defied explanation. And then she heard it, a whisper, soft and faint, calling her name. "Hana." She turned to run, but it was too late, for in the shadows she saw her mother's face, pale and gaunt, staring back at her. But it wasn't her mother. It was something else, something that wore her mother's face like a mask, its eyes hollow and its mouth open in a silent scream. Hana screamed and fled, never to return. But the hospital remained, its doors locked, its windows dark, a tomb for the restless dead. And the spirits waited, patient and eternal, for their next visitor. Have you ever heard whispers in the dark? Share your own terrifying tales in the comments below.